Hey, what's up seekers? Welcome back. In last week's episode, we saw the way in which Maimonides lays out his 7-step educational, contemplative, and meditative training plan for the individual to come closer to God in our walkthrough of the mystical chapter of the Guide 351. Today we're going to be analyzing that same chapter, beginning with an attempt to map and schematize it, followed by a look at its primary themes, its language, and lastly, its relationship to mysticism and its impact upon the kabbalists. Hope you enjoy. Let us begin by trying to map the contemplative trajectory and meditative program which Maimonides lays out in chapter 351. There have been a few ways proposed to chop up and schematize chapter 51's spiritual journey. We're going to be building here particularly on David Blumenthal's extensive work on this chapter, adjusting it slightly as we see fit. Blumenthal divides the spiritual journey taught by Maimonides in 351 into 3 stages. The first he calls apprehension, the second contemplation, and the third continuous contemplation culminating in mystical experience. Let's unpack that a bit. The first step in Maimonides' journey begins with education, with obtaining adequate knowledge about God and reality through the mediums of mathematics, logic, science, physics, and lastly, metaphysics. Because Maimonides believes that without an adequate and accurate knowledge of God and reality, one is not on a path to truth, which is synonymous for him with God and reality, but simply floundering in their own illusions and superstitions. And this process of procuring accurate knowledge about God and reality is for Maimonides not only an activity in exercising one's rationality, but is also an explicitly religious activity. It's an act of worship. As Paul Farmer puts it, the process of reaching the correct cognizance of the truly absolute God is itself an act of worship. Correct apprehension of God is the prime element of worship. Without it, the object of worship would be a false god. It is integral to one's worship to have a correct notion of God, which they are focusing on, or else it is not God at all which they're focusing on, but some sort of idol of their own creation. And the reason why it is specifically science, mathematics, physics, and the like, which make up the course of Maimonides' recommended study, is because he believes that while God's self, is unknowable and beyond the reaches of the limited human mind, we can come to know something of God by studying God's handiwork, this beautiful world that we live in. This first stage on the Maimonidean path towards God culminates in the full acquisition of a true knowledge and an accurate conception of God. Maimonides also calls this first stage love of God, because love for him is always commensurate to the degree of knowledge one possesses about the object of their love. As he writes, according to the knowledge, so is the love. In his conception, one cannot love a thing without knowing it, and the more one knows a thing, the greater their love for it becomes. And this is particularly the case, according to Maimonides, when it comes to God. At this point, we can begin to conceptually divide the Maimonidean journey into 2 parts. Up until this point, it has been the purpose of the journey to acquire correct knowledge and an accurate conception of God. And the stages that follow will be the work of contemplating and meditating upon that conception of God. Beginning with concentrating on God at certain opportune moments throughout the day, and moving on to more advanced levels of concentration and meditation, as we'll see. This next stage we can call, to use Maimonides' own words, worship of God, which is something of an umbrella stage, beginning with selective moments of concentration, as we just said, and culminating in a constant devotion of oneself entirely to God in both heart and mind. On Blumenthal's reading, the first half of the journey, culminating in true knowledge and love of God, refers to a cognitive process, which culminates in his language in an intellectual, rational, analytic, and philosophical apprehension of God, while this next stage, and those to follow, meditating upon this notion of God, consists in Blumenthal's opinion of a post-cognitive activity, a spiritual, meditative, experiential, and mystical apprehension of God. Gideon Freudenthal, it is worth noting, disagrees with Blumenthal's distinction and dichotomy here between the rational/philosophical and the meditative/mystical along the path, and rejects his assumption that Maimonides' mysticism, or mysticism in general for that matter, is post-cognitive, post-intellectual, or post-rational. Freudenthal instead proposes a form of Maimonidean mysticism which is not only not opposed to rationality, or even after rationality or philosophy, but one which deeply coheres to philosophy and rationality, both in its origins, explanations, and outcomes, and one which boldly and unapologetically follows the rhythms and rules of rationality, following them audaciously and demonstrably all the way through the spheres of the heavens to the throne of the divine, as we've been lining out in the previous classes. I'll leave you to pick whichever interpretation works better for you, but remember, they're just interpretations. Moving then into the second bracket of stages, those of worship and contemplation upon God, Maimonides instructs the individual on how to actually go about meditating upon God, which begins with learning to clear one's mind, the sine qua non of any meditative or spiritual practice, and maybe even of mental health in general. What differentiates Maimonides' meditation from mental health or mindfulness meditations, however, is that for Maimonides, this clearing of the mind is undertaken so that once cleared out, it can be filled with God. Once one learns to clear their mind, Maimonides instructs the individual to practice concentrating on the words of prayer and to think of God while praying, beginning first with thinking of God while reciting the first verse of the Schema prayer, and extending gradually over the course of many years, the duration of time one is able to think about God, to extend larger and larger portions of one's prayer, and eventually during the performance of all of one's religious duties, that they should all be encompassed and accompanied by the constant, undistracted awareness of God. Maimonides then extends the borders of this single-minded contemplation upon God from just during the performance of one's religious duties and obligations, which, mind you, for a practicing Jew is already most of their day, to include also all of one's ordinary, so-called mundane parts of one's day, when one is eating, drinking, bathing, or talking with their spouses and children or others, and when one is alone in bed at night. In all those moments, in every moment of one's life, at this level of worship now, instructs Maimonides in his spiritual boot camp, one should constantly be meditating upon God, never allowing God to leave one's mind and heart, even for but a moment. A level of concentration, by the way, which he believes not everyone can achieve. So don't feel bad if you feel like it's a bit too much for you. Incidentally, it's been proposed by some scholars that this Maimonidean conception of constant attachment to God in one's mind, even during one's mundane activities, went on to influence the Hasidic concept of dveikut, of clinging or cleaving to God in a likewise constant fashion some 600 years down the theological line from Maimonides, and it does seem in fact, from the language that the Hasidic masters use, that they were in fact almost certainly quoting or at very least paraphrasing him. We will see more of that soon. After one has gone through the first educational stages that we mentioned of requiring accurate knowledge about God, and the second meditative stages of worship of God, to the final extent that one is able to direct their minds entirely towards God, excluding from their thought any other thing for the entirety of one's day, the individual reaches a stage which Maimonides calls a state of prophecy, the state in which one is so fully focused on nothing but God, that they abandon all else, including their body, and unite their mind with the mind of God, the cosmic mind. In an earlier class, we elaborated at greater length about the way that Maimonides understands prophecy to function, namely, in one sentence we'll try here, the opening of one's mind to the influx and overflow of divine cognition coming from the active intellect and uniting with it. Check out that class if you'd like to see Maimonides' theory of prophecy laid out in much greater detail. The final climactic stage on the spiritual journey that Maimonides lays out for us in chapter 351, the climax of the guide, is the kiss of death, a moment towards the end of one's life in a physical body, which in a state of joy, love, bliss, and rapturous pleasure, one's soul separates from their body and cleaves to God. Following on the prior stages of perfect conception and apprehension of God, of ultimate reality, and an unceasing contemplation by a perfect person upon that perfect conception, finally comes this intense and consuming love and perfect pleasure in one's contemplation and apprehension of God, which results in no less than the perfect death itself, the misat nishikin, the death by a kiss from the lips of God, God alone, which Maimonides gives us reason to believe is a death so extraordinary that it ruptures and redefines the very categories of life and death itself, a death pregnant with intimations of immortality, an undying kiss, born from unceasing meditation that escorts the intellect into an eternity of blissful contemplation and union with the mind of God. Just to step back a second and remind you of the epistemology, the theory of knowledge at play here, that we outlined in much greater detail in an earlier episode in the series, in case this is all starting to sound a little too mystical for the rational Maimonideans in the crowd. We can summarize the cognitive epistemic journey, the intellectual journey, that the individual takes from ordinary thinking to intellectual union with God, according to Maimonides, into these three stages. First, we start off with Maimonides' position that any successful act of thinking, particularly that related to ideas, forms, or universals, namely philosophical thinking, consists of a union between the mind of the individual, the idea they're thinking about, and the activity of thinking itself, the knower, the knowing, and the known, as Maimonides puts it. And this moving of one's thought from a state of potential to a state of actualization, to borrow his language, of active thinking, only happens on Maimonides' account with the active help and participation of the divine overflow coming from God through the cosmic spheres and the active intellect to the individual. The next stage is when the individual turns their thought to God and God alone, achieving the highest stage of intellection, the state of consciousness which Maimonides calls prophetic, as we mentioned earlier, in which the human mind is transformed into and becomes identical with the cosmic active intellect itself. And finally, once that state of perfect intellection is achieved, the divine overflow reaches the person fully and creates a bond between them and God. However, during one's lifetime, distracted as one is by the needs of their body and the world, that bond between them and God is a temporary one, coming and going depending on one's state of mind, coming when they are in contemplation and going when they are distracted. But as life carries on and the body weakens, one's concentration can be strengthened, growing stronger and stronger as one approaches death, until, with the perfect death itself, the saintly individual may transition into a permanent state of union with God, their minds preserved for eternity in the amber of the cosmic mind, bound in the bundle of eternal life. If you haven't seen the past few episodes in the series, where we laid out the basic concepts of Maimonides' epistemology, cosmology, metaphysics, this episode might not be making so much sense to you. If I can recommend, you might want to go back, catch up on those, freshen up, and then continue here. But if you have already, or if this is making sense, then please, by all means, continue with us. Let's trace out the core philosophical themes running through this chapter, from the parable of the palace, all the way up until its inner chamber and its final dying kiss. The first thing I'd like to bring to your attention is Maimonides' depiction of the path towards God as one of overcoming the body, of transcending corporeality, both the corporeality of the individual and the corporeality of their concept of God. In the previous episodes, we spoke about the importance of this need to transcend corporeality and why it's a prerequisite for the human-divine merger. Just to briefly recap here, in Maimonides' thinking, the need to transcend corporeality is so central because it allows for the possibility of full identification of the cognizing subject with the essence of the cognized object, uniting the form of the subject, their mind, with the form of the object, the idea of what it is, uniting idea with idea, intellect with intellect, essence with essence, neither impeded by any materiality or bodiliness. Maimonides reminds us here in chapter 351 that it is the intellect which is the bond between the human and God, and that the human has the capacity to strengthen this bond by choosing to exercise their intellect. But a choice which Maimonides concedes is a difficult one to make while, quote, the bodily humors are in effervescence. In modern parlance, while one is still young and hot-blooded, youth is indeed wasted on the young. According to Maimonides, those who perfect themselves to the utmost degree, namely the patriarchs and the prophets, particularly Aaron, Miriam, and above all Moses, had liberated themselves from their bodies, from the source of their mundane hindrances, and achieved the highest levels of cognition and union with the divine active intellect, unearthing, as it were, their true state of nature, which, according to Maimonides, is only obscured in ordinary people by their own sins, shortcomings, and coarseness. Once these impediments are removed, the obstructions that separate us from God, particularly available in the final moments of unveiling and decorporealizing, namely in the moment of death, the bond between these individuals and God, namely the intellect, was, according to Maimonides, able to fully unite with God in a immortal, unceasing unity of enduring permanence, in which the intellect remains in one and the same state, writes Maimonides, united with the divine like one of the cosmic intellects. It's really Moses who exemplifies this stage for Maimonides, who, in his opinion, was the father of all prophets, who achieved greater knowledge of God than any other human, who lacked any flaw and was not held back by his body, who transformed himself into pure thought, essentially, into the status of the angels, and who, in that state of pure intellect, remained permanently united with God. And in that state, Moses and all who reach there never really die. It's a state of undying immortality. As Maimonides writes, the afterlife of the soul consists in the existence of its known object, namely God, since this known object and the soul are one thing, as the greatest philosophers have taught. And because God is naturally immortal, the mind fixated no longer on that which is subject to death, decay, and corruption, namely the body, but upon God, in an unceasing meditation, uniting and identifying with its object of intellection, it too, the mind, becomes immortal, naturally. This, Maimonides gives us, is some form of rational immortality, if we can say so ourselves. The next thing to notice here is that Maimonides in chapter 351 reinterprets and reinvents what it means in Judaism to worship God. The worship of the heart, avodash balev, consists for Maimonides in becoming engulfed in an all-consuming passion, an ishq, a love of the lover for the beloved, a silent, solitary devotion of the heart, and it is to this end, according to Maimonides' reading, that every single one of the 613 biblical commandments, which he enumerated so diligently in his other works, points, in Maimonides' opinion, to one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to an all-consuming love for God. This love, of course, as we've been saying, is proportionate to our understanding of God, an experience whose highest reaches reach the highest levels of prophecy, accompanied by the death of the body, or a simulated death of the body in which its distractions, desires, and gratifications are so suppressed, withheld, and sublimated that the mind can reach its purest state, opening itself fully to the influx of consciousness from the divine active intellect, a state of mind so purified that Maimonides describes it as culminating in prophecy, providence, angelification, and ultimately union with God via the bond that unites them, namely the intellect. This may be some form of Maimonidean mystical rationalism, if we can say so ourselves. Let us turn our attention now to the words Maimonides uses here in the chapter, because words do matter. Towards the beginning of the chapter, in Maimonides' description of the journey of the individual towards God, his explication of the parable of the palace, Maimonides begins by employing metaphors of distance and spatial closeness, coming close to the king, moving from outside the country, the city, the palace walls, to inside the palace, etc., etc. And Maimonides continues with this imagery and metaphors of spatiality in his spiritual advice to his reader, writing, "One who apprehends the true realities must endeavor to come close to God by strengthening the intellect, the bond between the human and the divine." And later again, Maimonides describes intellectual worship as nearness to God and being in God's presence, metaphors of distance, presence, closeness. However, as the chapter progresses, Maimonides escalates his language, moving from metaphors of spatiality, closeness and farness, to a more explicit language of union. When Maimonides writes about the most perfected of all people, Moses and the patriarchs, Maimonides writes, "Because of the union of their intellects through the apprehension of God, it came about that God made a lasting covenant with each of them. For in those four, namely the patriarchs and Moses, union with God, namely apprehension of God and love of God, became manifest." To put this in simple English, or at least in relatively simple English, Maimonides believes that there is an ultimate level of divine worship, attainable by the perfect noble ones, in which the human is united with God through the unity of the intellect in their apprehension of God. As Maimonides moves here from more conventional religious language of the individual coming closer to God, to what I think we may fairly call Maimonides' more radical mystical language of no longer merely closeness, but of union with God, as Maimonides makes this linguistic transition, the healthy theistic distance between the human and God becomes awfully undermined, with the unitive language employed here testing and blurring the neat boundaries separating between the human and the divine. As Maimonides quotes in the chapter, Ki im avonotechem, for it is only our sins, says the biblical text, which keep us separate from God. Take away the sins, the delusions of the mind, and away goes the separation. Once we're speaking here of mystical language, it's worth noting that Maimonides describes the love cultivated for God in these highest, deepest moments as passionate desire, joy, and bliss, all telltale signs of some mystical activity going on. He also employs some more classic mystical language, as we've been saying, phrases like standing before or encountering God, being in God's presence, complete devotion and exclusive dedication to God, as well as even more extreme unitive mystical language, words like conjunction and union with God, itisal and itihad in Arabic, and cleaving or bonding and union with God, dvekut and hitachdut in Hebrew, as translated by Maimonides' closest disciples and heirs, including his own son Abraham and his official translator, Shmuel ibn Tibbon. The kind of language that indicates to us, the reader, that what is being spoken of here in the chapter is some kind of unitive mystical experience. Much of this terminology, Blumenthal, Pessin, Pines, and Lobel all point out, is shared by Maimonides with his Sufi contemporaries. Despite having no lack of technical and philosophical language to choose from for expressing his religious philosophical thought, the fact that Maimonides chooses to employ the language of the mystics, according to some of these scholars, is another strong nod in the direction of a mystical reading of this chapter in Maimonides' writing. Maimonides, however, just to keep everyone's expectations in check, does believe that this rank of union with God isn't within the reaches of any ordinary person. Most of us, himself humbly included in that category, can at best hope to strive for the rank mentioned earlier, namely closeness to God, which results from total devotion to God, peddling back his language when speaking of ordinary people from that of union to that of closeness. But the fact that he does employ the more extreme unitive language, even for just select individuals throughout history, does put his religious philosophy firmly in the realm of mysticism. Mysticism being here defined, at least in the Abrahamic context, as belief in the possibility of union with or absorption into the deity or the absolute. And that definition is straight from Google, plagiarizing the Oxford Languages Dictionary. Just to reiterate a point that we've made a few times throughout this series, just because Maimonides may have advocated a form of religious philosophical mysticism, it does not make him cease to be a rationalist. In fact, there is no a priori self-evident reason why those two categories must be mutually exclusive. And, as we might see in the example of Maimonides, not only were they not mutually exclusive, but they were in fact highly compatible and mutually interdependent, Maimonides' rationalism being mystical in nature, and his mysticism being rational. One last thing I'd like to touch on in our analysis of Maimonides' Guide 351 is not so much the chapter in itself, but the afterlife of the chapter, the impact of Maimonides' unitive language and metaphors upon the Jewish mystics that followed him, the 13th century kabbalists, many of them who started their intellectual careers and spiritual journeys under the tutelage and influence of Maimonides, beneath the wings of the great eagle as he was known. Many of them, even some of the most influential Kabbalists in Jewish history, people like Moshe de Leon, Joseph Jigatilia, Abraham Abulafia, and others, who, in addition to beginning their journeys as committed Maimonideans, never fully abandoned and disengaged themselves from their former philosophical master, even long after having become serious and even definitive Kabbalists, continuing to blend their Maimonideanism and their Kabbalah until the very end of their lives in some cases. Shalom Tishby, Del Wolfson, and Afterman have already highlighted in one way or another the affinity and influences between Maimonides' notion of communion with God that we've been discussing here, and the concept of dveikut, the mystical union or communion with God, which becomes an incredibly central point for the Kabbalists and their spiritual heirs, the Chassidic masters. Let's start with an example from one of the great early Kabbalists, a younger contemporary of Maimonides, Rabbi Yitzchak Saginar, Isaac the Blind. In Isaac the Blind's writings, we find the same motifs that we find here in Guide 351 being explored, those of the unity of the human and divine thought, what he calls dveikut hamachshava, the cleaving of thought, to the point where in Isaac's own description of divine worship and prophecy, the boundaries between the human and the divine mind are overcome in ways strikingly similar to Maimonides' depiction of those very same processes. Another beautiful example from among these early figures, combining Kabbalah and philosophy, can be found in the book Sha'ar Shemaim, The Gate of Heaven by Isaac ibn Latif, which, while not quoting Maimonides explicitly, seems to very much have him peering from between the lines. He writes like this: "Holy and pure worship entails the conjunction of the human intellect in actuality with its intelligible, which is the active intellect, in the image of the form of the kiss, and from it the conjunction expands to the supernal cause, one atop the other, in the matter of the concatenation, the causal cosmic chain, until it reaches the great archon which is called the first emanation from the primal cause, from God, without any intermediary. And then the individual's conjunction with this supernal entity will be the most perfect spiritual conjunction that is possible, as it says, 'And to God shall you cleave.'" All these philosophical themes that we've seen in the thought of Maimonides find themselves creatively repackaged here in Kabbalistic language. The most unique of those concepts featuring, perhaps, is Maimonides' allegorical interpretation of the kiss from the Song of Songs as referring to the bond and union of the human intellect with the active intellect or God. Maimonides' dynamic rereading of this provocative imagery, building on earlier rabbinic readings before him, gets taken up by a whole host of 13th century Kabbalists, including Ezra of Gerona and Abraham Abulafia. It is presumably his reading of Guide 351 which led the great father of the modern academic study of Jewish mysticism, Gershon Shalom, to point out that the 13th century Kabbalists had the ability to attract many Maimonideans by means of one common element to the two camps, namely, the doctrine of mystical dveikut, which is not absent from the Guide to the Perplexed, writes Shalom. Both Maimonides and the Kabbalists, in Wolfson's opinion, despite the distinct camps that we often place them into, both developed unitive experiences, sharing the vocabulary of dveikut and hitachdut, bonding and union, for Maimonides in the Arabic itisal and itihad, the conjunction of the mind or soul to that which was divine and immaterial. For Maimonides, this took the contemplative shape and language of intellectual worship, passionate love, resulting from rational apprehension of everything that one can ascertain about divine matters, and the cleansing of the mind of all but the thought of God, a worship of the heart which entails an ecstatic unitive state, in Wolfson's language. In Wolfson's opinion, the worship of the heart of which Maimonides speaks is phenomenologically analogous and on par with the descriptions of the dveikut experiences which we find in Kabbalistic literature, and Wolfson believes conversely that Maimonides' religious philosophy went on to influence the Kabbalists, both of the ecstatic/prophetic and the theurgical/theosophic persuasions, in their own understanding and practice of union and ecstasy, prayer and prophecy. In Wolfson's final estimation, the Kabbalists were greatly indebted to Maimonides' writings as a source of inspiration for their own speculations and experiences in ways more fundamental than have been hitherto appreciated by scholars. And in Wolfson's exploration of the nexus between ecstatic union, vision, and prayer in Maimonides and the 13th century Kabbalists, he concludes that Maimonides' conception of intellectual worship as the passionate love of God leading to the highest forms of prophecy influenced not only the school of prophetic Kabbalah, but also what's known as Theosophic Kabbalah, or the Kabbalah of the Sfirot, concluding that it would be no exaggeration to say that the spiritual/intellectual landscape of 13th century Kabbalah, not to mention succeeding generations that evolved therefrom, is unimaginable unless one takes to heart that the ruminations of the masters of Jewish esoteric lore were incubated in the shadows of the great eagle, Moses Maimonides. Maimonides' influence and impact upon the great mystics has been observed beyond even the boundaries of Judaism on Christian and Muslim mystics like Meister Eckhart and Ibn Hud. Joseph Schwartz, commenting on the former, writes, "Eckhart's encounter with Maimonides is most fascinating precisely because it does not present some simple case of influence. Instead, it confronts us with the most rich and complex intellectual encounter, one that bears some surprisingly fruitful results." To wrap our head around why Maimonides' thought was so important to the mystics and Kabbalists following him, despite the simultaneous severe rejection he receives from many of them, it's worth noting Adam Afterman's keen observation that Maimonides is the first medieval Jewish philosopher to employ unitive language to describe the conjunction of the human and divine intellect. Afterman writes, The use of unitive vocabulary in Jewish philosophy introduced into the Jewish world a very strong formula of union that correlated thought, transformation, and being. Through such a process, provided with an ontological bridge between the material and metaphysical realms, the human agent may climb the hierarchy of being. This bridge allows the human worldly agent to transform into a pure noetic being, i.e. an angel, or transform into a son of God. And as an angel, they may participate in the divine order of knowledge according to their place in the metaphysical hierarchy. If that made sense, good. But if you just said, what on earth just happened, check out this previous episode we made on Maimonides' cosmology and theory of prophetic angelification, and it will all make sense. I promise. Well, I don't promise, but I hope. The bottom line of all of this is that Maimonides' philosophy, as found in his Guide 351, which we outlined in the last episode and analyzed in this one, and as found elsewhere, can certainly be described as a kind of intellectualist or philosophical mysticism, the attainment of a connection with the divine through the intellect, to quote Diana Lobel. Maimonides' passionate experience of God takes place through a heightened or inspired state of mind, which includes awe at both its exhilarating discoveries and its moments of perplexity and wonder. Maimonides accomplished his teaching on this subject, to quote Blumenthal, by reinterpreting Hebrew terms and metaphors drawn from the biblical and rabbinic traditions against the backgrounds of the Neo-Aristotelian and Sufi usages of his intellectual milieu. In doing so, he called upon common conceptualities and formulated a new and stunning vision of the spiritual capacities of humankind. I hope you enjoyed that little analysis of Guide 351. Just to very briefly recap what we did here today, we began by providing a schema, a map of Chapter 351, breaking up into its primary components of the job of educating oneself about God and then meditating upon that idea, which ultimately leads to a perfect union and death in that moment of divine contemplation, and immortal death as it is. We then discuss some of the primary philosophical themes that emerge in 351, those of overcoming the body to unite with God, and Maimonides' rereading of worship in his religious philosophical context. We then discuss the language that Maimonides uses in the chapter, moving from languages of distance and closeness to those of union, borrowing perhaps from his fellow Sufis, a mystical language of uniting with God, quite an extreme language in fact. We then spoke about how these ideas and language got picked up by the kabbalists of the 13th century, looking at some key figures in text where those thoughts may have filtered their way through into, and discuss some of the scholars who talk about this influence of Maimonides' thought on the kabbalists that follow him. We tried figuring out what that means for these medieval thinkers, these kabbalists and philosophers, using the thought of Maimonides, and why perhaps Maimonides' thought was so important and influential for them. I hope you enjoyed. In the upcoming episodes, we're going to dive into Maimonides' thoughts on the limits of human reason and what it just might mean for his mysticism. We might discuss a bit of a critique of his philosophy and question what perhaps was its ultimate goal and what it might mean for us today in the 21st century. Thank you so much to all of you who joined us again to learn. Thank you to our patrons who so generously and kindly support this project. If you can afford it, please do consider joining them. It really does help a lot in keeping the project going. Thank you again to Steve for hosting us, and thank you to all of you who joined us to learn once again. I hope to hear from you in the comments and reconnect with you for next episode, and until then, keep seeking.